I'm proud to represent the Illawarra Women's Health Centre. We are a small organisation. We stand on the right side of history. We stood up for the voice, and we stand up for solidarity with women everywhere, speaking out against the occupation and the genocide in Gaza for the last 18 months. We've been holding monthly breakfasts to try and pull support for each other and for those who are grieving for the losses they are watching. We are having this conversation as yet another disturbing juncture where, after 2 months of complete blockade of food, medicine, water, any kind of aid to the people of Gaza, they're starving. We now hear today Netanyahu announcing that they intend to annex the whole of Gaza and remove all the people. In addition, they have publicly declared that they will be doing this very shortly, and this is after 77 years of occupation. And in all of that, as we know, women everywhere suffer disproportionately and are used as a weapon, and certainly this genocide has been evidence of that. It's unbelievably cruel and it just defies explanation, really. We will have a panel of speakers up the front here, and Chris Sidoti will be giving us a précis of his work on how the war has affected women in Palestine, and this is sort of what spurred us on to actually focus on the role of women in this occupation. I would like to just remind you the toilets are down that corridor there, drinks are just over here on that counter. We will have an opportunity for people to ask questions and for us to mix at the end. But firstly, I'd like to invite Arnie Barb Nicholson to come up and do Welcome to Country. And I'd just like to point out for the Dutton crew that a welcome to country is done by the people who come from the country, and the acknowledgement is done by other people like us. He clearly did not understand that. So Arnie Barb is well known to a lot of us. She is a Wadi Wadi elder. She's been a lifetime grassroots campaigner for social justice. She has an honorary doctorate in law. She is Wollongong Citizen of the Year in 2024. And she's a First Nations Writing Network Lifetime Achievement Award winner. She's written several books, and that might be how some of you know her. And we thank her for looking after us spiritually, locally, for all her life. Thank you. Welcome, Arnie Barb.
I'll just begin by saying I want to meet this woman. So, thank you very much, Kim, for that wonderful introduction and for also just framing what the evening's about. I think that's really important. We have a word. I'm Auntie Barb Nicholson. I'm a Wadi Wadi woman. Wadi Wadi people are the cultural custodians of this land we call the Illawarra region. Okay, and pardon me, I want to pay respects to the sacred land, and I say sacred because regardless of what's been built on it, dug out of it and drowned or cut down in the forest, regardless of all of that, it's still sacred land, and simply because you cannot take the spirit out of the land of the land remains there. So, yes, I pay respect to this sacred land. I pay respect to our two grandparents, which local people here will know as Mount Kembla, grandfather, and Mount Kira, grandmother. If you happen to be there, please be respectful to our grandparents, and we ask that you always be respectful on country. I want to pay respect also to elders, past and present. I don't say emerging. There's no such thing as in my book. Okay, you're either an elder or you're not. So, emerging could be a 6-month-old baby. Come on. Okay. I think to pay respect to elders is absolutely vital, simply because without the work that they've on a grand scale, then I wouldn't be standing here. The right to be doing cultural welcomes would not exist if they had not done that work. 20 years ago, there was no such thing happening as a cultural welcome. Now we can do it. And why do we do it? We don't do it to make people feel good, as the neo-Nazis like to point out that we do. We don't. We're not here to spit out platitudes to make people feel good. What we're here about is to make sure that all visitors on country, whether you're coming to stay or you're just passing through, that we offer you, in our cultural belief, spiritual protection while you are on country. That's what a cultural welcome is about. Marcia Langton the other day made a similar comment about that, and I was very happy to see that she did. I also want to welcome and pay respect to all women in this room particularly. Aboriginal history has many parallels with what is going on with marginalised women wherever you are in the world, and particularly the women of Palestine. I mentioned earlier when I did a little bit for the thingy jig, digital, what do you call it? YouTube thing. I'm totally a dinosaur with technology, so I mentioned to him how my heart isn't big enough to hold all the empathy that you deserve, that the women and children of Palestine deserve. It is just not big enough. There's too much empathy, and I overflow, and I'll be in tears. They're just about there. I'll talk myself into it. But the parallels are there. Why do we feel such empathy? Because we have shared experiences. As a colonised people, we know what's what. Aboriginal women were routinely used as weapons of war in the takeover and the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their land, and used in such ways as rape, as in all ways, and anything to get rid of us, just like Netanyahu's trying to do to your sisters in Gaza. It was, even into the 1970s, it was quite routine for women, particularly in Aboriginal women in remote communities. If they had to be hospitalised for anything, they were routinely surgically sterilised. So I couldn't have any more kids, like getting rid of the breeders, stop them somehow or other. That was even as late as the 70s. There's a lot of documented evidence, and I did a lot of research on that at the time. When surgical sterilisation was outlawed, then it was replaced with a contraceptive drug called deplorable, which had long since been banned in America because of its long-term sterilising effects. But young Aboriginal girls were routinely taken and injected on a 6-monthly basis over 2 years, which is supposed to render them sterile forever. So we have some commonalities. Scale of it is different, of course. I acknowledge that. But I think those experiences, the knowledge of those histories, the knowledge of the routine rape and torture of Aboriginal women, it's just horrendous. I don't know what the comparison would be if you took it on a per capita basis. I'm not sure. I have no idea. But let me say this, there's enough of it to make me know that if we don't stand together, if we don't support each other through all of these dreadful, dreadful hardships, then our value in ourselves is diminished. We need to do that. We need to stand up and be bloody counted, you know. Stand up and be counted. All of that is... I wanted to talk about that a little bit. It's got nothing to do with a cultural welcome to country, but I hope it puts... I hope it gives you something to know. You're not alone. I know Aboriginal women everywhere would be very much on board with what you do. We're all wearing keffiyehs these days, I can tell you. So, but back to welcome to country. I'm just going to say one word we have that doesn't, in Wadi language, it does not mean welcome. We didn't have words for welcome. What it actually means is you can come in now. So if I say Yolonga, it means you can come in now. It's like you've knocked on the door, you've waited to be invited, and when I say Yolonga, that means come in. Yolonga. Thank you.
Chris Sidoti, for those who have not had the pleasure of meeting him before, is a Commissioner representing Australia on the International Court of Justice, and he has presented once before here in Wollongong about the situation in Palestine and the cases against Netanyahu and other war criminals. And this time he is presenting information to us about the effects of war on women, which is a new report that he has written. He's a very dear friend in this struggle for Palestine's liberation and an important witness for what is actually happening there and our role in that. So I'd like to welcome Chris Sidoti up to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Auntie Barb, for allowing me to enter. I needed permission to do so because I don't live in this country. I live in Gurindji land, and so I've come down from Sydney today, from where I live on the Gurindji land, and I'm very pleased that you have permitted me to enter your country. And I acknowledge you and the other elders, and thank you very much for the care that you have taken of this country for all of our benefit. I should just clarify my status for a minute too. I'm a commissioner on a United Nations Commission of Inquiry into Palestine and Israel. Our Commission of Inquiry is established by the UN Human Rights Council. We do work with the International Court of Justice, but I'm not a member of that court, but one of 3 commissioners on this Commission of Inquiry. Earlier today, I read some comments by an official from UNICEF who has been into the Gaza Strip on many occasions over the last year and a half. And the comment she made was that every time I have been here in the last year and a half, I have thought it cannot get worse. It is rock bottom. And each time, she said, I have been there, I have thought the same thing. And being in Gaza last week, I thought again it could not get worse. That it is worse than it has ever been over the last year and a half. but it keeps on getting worse. I receive, because I'm a UN Commissioner, I receive information all the time from UN sources about what's going on in the Gaza Strip. And there's a very useful weekly summary that comes out about the events of the previous week. And it's always extremely distressing reading. There is still media attention on what is happening, but nothing like what was occurring in the early days. I doubt that there is very much realisation that between 50 and 60 people are killed every day in the Gaza Strip. 50 to 60 people every single day. And this information that I get has a summary of mass killing events that have occurred in the previous week. Let me just read 3 days. On the 25th of April, Anzac Day, about 3 in the afternoon, 10 Palestinians, including 5 brothers, were killed when a residential building was hit. Same day, about 3:10, 9 Palestinians, including a married couple and their 5 children, were killed when a residential building was hit. The next morning, 1 a.m, at least 22 Palestinians, including at least 13 children and 6 women, were killed when a residential building was hit. The next day, 8:10, 13 Palestinians, including a woman and her 6 children, were killed when a residential building was hit. That night, a little after midnight, 10 Palestinians, including at least 3 children, were killed when a residential building was hit. The same day, the same time, a bit after midnight, 10 Palestinians were killed when a residential building was hit. I mean, it reads so routine, doesn't it? You know, it's almost as though this is the best that we can expect. Did you notice in each of those accounts, a residential building was hit? In each of those accounts. And you notice in each of those accounts, women and children were the majority of those who were killed. Now, I haven't selected these from a great big long list. I've just gone into the report and taken 6 consecutive incidents, one after the other, and that's what they were. On the 30th of April, according to work undertaken by our Commission just in the last 2 days, on the 30th of April, the total territory of the Gaza Strip, controlled by Israel, that is, its corridors, the expanded border buffer, and the new security zone, amounts to more than 2/3 of the area of the Gaza Strip. That means that 2.3 million Palestinians resident in Gaza are now being squeezed into 1/3 of what was already an extremely small territory. And after we completed that work, so that goes up, we measured as of the 30th of April, 5 days later, the 5th of May, the Israeli cabinet decided to expand the Israeli military operation to take more of the territory under direct Israeli control and to expel all remaining Gazans from that part of the territory. That's how it is today. You know, that's how it is today in Gaza. And that's not even referring to the fact that it's now almost 70 days since the total siege was imposed. It is the longest period of siege, blockade, since the hostilities began on the 7th of October 2023, and in fact is the longest period of blockade that Gaza has ever been subjected to. And United Nations agencies on the ground report there is no food in the market. The kitchens that have been feeding people one meal a day for many, many months have had to close. The UN-sponsored bakeries have all closed. Water is in very short supply, if obtainable at all. And it is estimated that there are 3,500 children who are at imminent risk of starvation, in addition to tens of thousands more who are severely malnourished. The death toll now since 7 October 2023 is around about 52,000 on the official figures produced by the Ministry of Health. These figures are criticised by the Israeli military and by the United States, although they never produce any other estimates of their own. We consider those figures to be broadly reliable because the experience over the last 20 years has been that those figures are broadly reliable. Whenever there is an escalation in the fighting, the Ministry of Health does the counts, the United Nations after the event does its own counts, and they always come out within a few percentage points of the figures produced by the Ministry of Health. So the historical experience indicates that these figures are generally reliable, but perhaps not as reliable in this conflict as in past ones, because the Ministry of Health counts bodies, and many bodies have not been retrieved. During the short period of the ceasefire earlier this year, almost 1,000 bodies were dragged out from under the rubble where they had been for almost, or various periods, up to 15 months at that point. And it's estimated that there may be another 9,000 bodies under the rubble. So if there is any limitation to the figures produced by the Ministry of Health, the limitation is that they represent, in all probability, a significant underestimate of the total numbers of deaths. And they are also deaths that are directly resulting from the fighting and not indirectly as a result of, for example, starvation and disease. There's a lot of disease in Gaza. So that's the picture. And as my references to the bombings of these residential buildings indicates, predominantly the victims are women and children. When we came to produce this report back in March, when we were doing the research for it, one of the things that caused us to focus specifically on this was the number of casualties amongst women and girls that were being reported. Something like 60% of casualties, of fatalities, are women and children. And of those 33% are women and girls, and then the balance to bring it up to the 60% are boys. The proportion that are women and girls has grown consistently over the 20 years of repeated conflicts in Gaza. Back in the earliest conflict, in the period since Hamas took control in 2007, the conflict in 2008-2009, 15% of casualties, fatalities, were women and girls. In 2014, it was 21%. In the current one, 33%. We asked why this is so. How can it be explained that the proportion of fatalities has doubled among women and girls in the period of the 20 years? And it seemed to us that there were a couple of factors for that. One was exactly the factor that I have pointed to in telling those stories of the deaths at the end of April. residential buildings now are being targeted like they have never been targeted before. The Israeli military, under instructions from the Israeli government, have pursued a policy of total destruction. And that has meant that residential buildings have been bombed, and that's where women and children are, and so the number of women and children killed is so much greater. The second factor is a change in Israeli military instructions. They actually produce a militant to civilian death ratio. How many civilian deaths are acceptable according to the standards of the Israeli military for each combatant death, and at what level? So a senior commander justified the deaths of more civilians than a mere fighter or a courier, for example. Those ratios have been expanded during the course of the current conflict, so that the Israeli operating instructions, the modus operandi, now tolerates a far higher number of civilian fatalities than they did in the past. And we have seen the results of that. We have seen the results of bombing residential buildings and accepting a higher proportion of civilian deaths in the fact that, as I said, 60% of at least 52,000 fatalities are women and children. That's what caused us to look specifically at the question of sex and gender violence, the impact on women and girls, and reproductive violence as well. We decided that we'd prioritise our investigations in that area over the last few months. Our work focused for the first time on reproductive violence. Past UN reports that have looked at gender-based violence have not specifically looked at the question of reproductive violence. But we were struck by the ways in which women were being affected in relation to birthing and fertility generally. In one part, the impact on women was indirect. The destruction of hospitals meant that prenatal care became almost non-existent. Births were no longer assisted medically or even by midwives in a very large majority of cases. Postnatal care became almost impossible. So the safety of women before, during and after birth was severely compromised, and that remains the case. And of course, the safety, the well-being of the children who were born was also severely compromised. So the first factor was the lack of access to adequate or proper medical care. The second factor was the lack of access to medicines, including analgesics and anaesthesia, and the kinds of even simple antibiotics that are often necessary to stave off infection. And remember that this is occurring in a situation where infection is rampant because there is no water, there's no good food, there is no shelter, people are living in squalid conditions. I can't even begin to describe the awfulness of sanitation, sewerage that have been described to us. So the lack of medicines had a very serious impact on maternal health and well-being, and that of newborn babies as well. And then the third factor is simply the impact of a lack of nutrition, lack of food and water on the capacity of women to have a healthy pregnancy and to deliver children in a way that they are able to be healthy and remain healthy after childbirth. They are weak, they are exhausted, they are malnourished, and so are the children who are born. So at one level, we can see that there is a serious impact on women's fertility, their reproductive health as a result of the war. But on top of that, we found incidents in which maternal health facilities and fertility facilities were being deliberately targeted. We reported to the General Assembly in October last year on what we considered to be a concerted, systematic, intentional plan to destroy Gaza's healthcare system. Within that, maternity wards in hospitals have been specifically targeted. You know, they have been shelled and they have been bombed. And there was one specific incident that took our attention, and that relates to a specialist fertility clinic, the largest in the Gaza Strip. That fertility clinic was destroyed by tank shells. It was clearly marked as a healthcare facility. It was clearly marked as a fertility clinic. It was known to the Israeli authorities that it was the largest fertility clinic in Gaza. And it was destroyed by tank shells, one of which went right into the part of the facility where most of the reproductive specimens and material was kept. 4,000 embryos were destroyed, and 1,000 other reproductive items, eggs and sperm, non-fertilised in other words. Now, when we looked at these facts and weighed up the consequences, we could only conclude that this was a deliberate attempt to undermine the fertility and the reproductive capacity of Palestinian women in Gaza. I mean, that was the only conclusion that we could draw. It was deliberate. It was intended to make births more difficult and more dangerous, and it was having that result, without doubt. We concluded that the actions in relation to fertility constituted two categories of genocidal act. One, making conditions of life impossible for Palestinian people, and the second, impairing the reproductive capacity of Palestinian women. And I'll come back to the significance of that finding in a minute or two. I haven't got long. I focus very much on the big picture, if you like, what's happening to women as a whole, and what's happening to the reproductive health system as a whole. But I need to mention as well the fact that individual women found themselves specifically targeted on many occasions. They have been targeted by sniper fire. An example of that, in an earlier report that we produced, we looked at the killing of two women in the grounds of the Catholic Church and Parish Complex in Gaza City, the only Catholic church and Catholic facility in Gaza. Two women, an elderly mother and her adult daughter, were crossing between two buildings in this compound, and both of them were shot and killed. There was no fighting going on at the time. They were, I think, shot in the head in both cases. There was no doubt, when we examined the evidence, no doubt in our minds that they were deliberately targeted and killed by snipers. And there were other incidents too. I'm using that as an example, not as the sole incident where that occurred. We're going to be reporting probably in July or August on children. And we'll also be reporting that we found repeated incidents where children, including very young children, have been deliberately targeted and killed by snipers. So this too seems to be part of the operating procedures that are accepted at least, if not ordered, in the situation of Gaza. But so far as individual women are concerned, we looked at what happens to women in their encounters with the Israeli military. You know, we saw how women are shamed by removal of the veil, headscarf, and other parts of clothing. The violation of women's home space, with some of those videos that I'm sure you've seen or heard of that Israeli soldiers have posted on the internet. Stripping women, generally not entirely, but largely, so near naked stripping in public places, including in front of male soldiers and male members of the Palestinian community. And the mistreatment of women detainees. When we released our report, just before the release, we had public hearings in Geneva where I sat and listened to the evidence of Palestinians from Gaza, but also lawyers who represented them and doctors who tried to provide medical services to them. And the lawyers representing Palestinian prisoners said to me that sexual touching, assault, threats of rape, humiliation, sexual humiliation of women and men have always occurred in Israeli detention, but that since October 2023, they considered that the nature of this had changed fundamentally. That in the past, the instances were few and seemed to be individualised. It had occurred, but not all that often, and not in a way that could be considered to be systematic. But now it was widespread, it was more severe, and it was clearly systematic. So a fundamental shift since October 2023. And this is occurring to women and men with different kinds of experiences. You know, we know that sexual violence is experienced differently by women and men. And so I'm not trivialising what happens to the men, but I'm saying that it's different from what happens to the women. That's how it is. I'm sorry, I've gone over, but I do want to, just very briefly, talk a little bit about law. I mentioned that when we were dealing with reproductive violence, we came to the conclusion that the activities of the Israeli forces in Gaza fell within two categories of genocidal act. And I need just to say a few words about genocide and where we're up to in this. Genocide is an international crime. It's defined in international law, and it is very, very difficult to prove. The law, like all criminal law, including our domestic law, requires both act and intention. In the case of genocide, there are 5 categories of genocidal act. 4 of those categories have been raised as relating to the situation in Gaza. In relation to the reproductive violence, we have found 2 of those categories established. The 5th category that has not been raised about Gaza concerns the transfer of the children of one group to another group. And that hasn't arisen in Gaza, but that is the basis for the work. In an earlier part of my life, I was a commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I was one of the commissioners who did the Bringing Them Home report on the stolen generations. And the basis of the finding in that report that those policies constituted genocide was because the actions fell within that category of the removal of children of one group to another. That doesn't apply in the case of Gaza. But we're examining all other 4 categories. In addition to act, you have to have intent. The difficulty with the law of genocide is that there are 2 different types of intent that have to be proved. One is the intent to do the act, and we have been finding that consistently over the time of our work. But the other is the intent to do the act with the purpose of destroying the group as a group in whole or in part. And that's very difficult to prove. The jurisprudence, the decisions of international courts, has made that a really, really tough test. We are now looking at that. I mean, I have to say, and I say it unapologetically, we have been hesitant to come to a determination of genocide, and we have not yet done so. We have now found that many acts fall within the categories of genocidal act. We have found that they have been committed intentionally, and we are now examining the issue of whether they were committed with a genocidal purpose. For us as lawyers, it's a tough question, but we'll be producing within a few months, still a few months off, a very long and very thorough analysis of that question, because we have been careful. So I just wanted to explain that legal background, because often the popular understanding of genocide is very different from the legal definition. And, you know, if you want to play lawyers with me, we can discuss that further later, but I don't want to go more than that for now. So I think that's probably as much as I need to say. I've talked too much, but at least gives you the flavour, the sense of what is going on now and what we have found. Thanks, Ellie.
Thank you, Chris. I do dispute what you say that you've spoken for too long, because myself, I could listen to you for hours, because the way that you lay out the evidence in such clear and compelling fashion, I think is exactly what we need to hear, because the evidence is unequivocal and it is unrelenting. It really is. And the sadness and the heartbreak and the horror of what is happening to women in Gaza, West Bank and East Jerusalem is sadly neglected by our community in general, Australia and the world. And that's the reason that the Women's Health Centre, my name's Sally, I represent the Women's Health Centre as well, wanted to bring this evening to come, because these kinds of reports, this kind of evidence, the clear and compelling nature of it really does need to see the light of day, and we need to prosecute the argument that it needs to stop. So I thank you again, Chris. We really appreciate you coming. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panellists. Chris is on the panel, and three amazing women. First, we have Sara Saleh, who's a Lebanese Palestinian human rights lawyer, activist and author, and she will be moderating the panel. Please welcome Sara. We also have Dr. Bushra Othman, who is a Palestinian Australian surgeon who has been to Gaza twice to support to deliver her surgical skills and support the population of Gaza. So please welcome Bushra. And thirdly, we have our very own Safaa Rayan, who's a Palestinian Illawarra local, an incredible activist, an inspiring woman to us here. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Before I begin, I really want to just spend a moment acknowledging Auntie Barb and thanking Auntie Barb for the generous welcome. I did manage to catch the tail end of it, and it is always a very important, I guess, reminder and reflection, but also a reminder for me to ground myself in place, in country, and understand my role and my responsibility as a daughter who has, who hails from a family and an ancestry that has been, comes from dispossession and is here on country complicit in dispossession. So I really want to affirm my commitment to First Nations communities here and affirm my commitment to the struggle for Indigenous justice, because we know that there is no freedom for Palestinians, there's no freedom for anyone until it starts here. So freedom from here to Palestine and everywhere in between always was, always will be, from the river to the sea. I also want to thank Sally and the team, the organizers, for putting this together. I know that this sort of event always takes a village. Thank you, and lots of last-minute things happening back and forth. And thank you all for choosing to spend the evening with us as well tonight. And we'll get right into it. Now, you all might be expecting. You were expecting Noor Haider. I was led to believe that, yeah, and you're like, that doesn't look like Noor. Yep, I'm definitely not Noor Haider. But I do have the very unenviable task of filling in the formidable Noor's shoes tonight. She's unwell, and I was happy to step in and steal her notes. So she did leave me in good stead with lots of juicy questions to ask our panel tonight, inshallah. And with that, I want to kick off with Chris. So that was a very sobering speech, very sobering keynote, and you have painted a harrowing picture for us. There's no two ways about it. And I think, for me, though, it's also such a critical record of testimony. It's a record for us to be able to use. It's an archive. And so for me, Chris, I wanted to ask you, this report, as we've heard, documents a horrific and wide range of systemic violations against Palestinian women, girls, and boys. How did the Commission of Inquiry collect this evidence? Specifically, how did you substantiate the claims? Who did you speak to, if you'd like to go into details? But more importantly, I'm interested in what barriers did you encounter trying to conduct this critical investigation?
Maybe I start with the last part first. The biggest barrier we encounter in all of our work is that the Israeli authorities prevent us from going on the ground and investigating on the ground, looking at sites, talking to people. They keep us out of Israel, but they also keep us out of Palestine. And because they control all of the external borders of Palestine, they can prevent us entering. So that is an obstacle, obviously, but it doesn't mean that we can't do our work. I referred briefly when I was talking to the fact that we had a couple of days of public hearings in Geneva during the course of finalising this report. And we spoke then, and we had spoken previously, to people who are on the ground in Gaza and in the West Bank. We can do that so far as Gaza is concerned to a certain extent by video. That depends upon whether electricity is available, whether they have the batteries to charge up their equipment. That has become much more difficult in the last 2 months than it had been previously because there's virtually no power anymore. So far as West Bank is concerned, it's still possible for many people on the West Bank to leave. So if they won't let us in, it is possible for people to come out to speak to us. We have spoken extensively to humanitarian workers, so doctors, people who are delivering aid, logistics officials, UN officials, who have been to Gaza and can report on what has happened. And some of the most moving testimony, I have to say, from those public hearings were from doctors who had spent time there and who spoke traumatised by the inability to actually be able to do their job. You know, they're doctors and they expected to be able to provide medical services, but the circumstances were such that they couldn't. You know about that. So we heard from them. We heard from lawyers who are representing Palestinian prisoners. We can't speak to Palestinian prisoners, but their lawyers are authorised to speak on their behalf to us. And now, these days, we have tens of thousands of pieces of digital evidence, photographic and video evidence, that in past wars was simply not available. Both the Hamas fighters on the 7th of October and the Israeli soldiers every day since then have prided themselves in taking videos of their actions and posting them on the internet. And sometimes they get taken down very quickly, but we have the capacity to monitor and scoop and save before things are removed. And so we have a huge quantity of digital evidence. The work that I was mentioning before about the areas of Gaza occupied by the Israelis, that was all done by satellite photography. And we also are able, through satellite photography, to measure in great detail, very specifically, the destruction of buildings and the extent of destruction. So there are many sources of information now that we can use, even though we still face the obstacle of not being able to be on the ground.
You mentioned some of the most critical testimony being that of doctors, rightly so, and that's a tragic segue, I guess, to my next question. Dr. Bushra Othman, as the first Australian Palestinian woman surgeon to go, or just as one of the first surgeons as well, but I say woman because it's relevant here, to go to mission on Gaza not once but twice. You've seen what the report documents up close, firsthand. So if you would like to share your experience, tell us about your mission to Gaza, tell us about what it was like volunteering there.
Just in a short few minutes, is it, Sara? The very first thing that happened, so I went in June, on June 13th for the first time for 3 weeks, and that was 3 days before Eid al-Adha, so one of the big celebrations for Muslims. And the very first thing when you enter through Gaza, they drop you off at a safe house, and that safe house was near the beach in Al-Mawasi. And so we managed to convince the guards at the safe house to take us down to the beach because we thought, we might never ever see Gaza ocean again. We were so I went first with an organisation called Panzima, which is an Australian-based organisation, so we were wearing our jackets, so you're automatically recognised as being someone, as an international volunteer. And so being a female, I had all these mothers come up to me on the beach holding their babies. And the first thing they said was, do you have any nappies for us? Like, do you have any baby formula? So we're thinking back now to almost a year ago that there was such a dire situation of baby formula and nappies even at that time. And Eid was on the Sunday, which was the 16th. And I remember when you'd asked some of the doctors beforehand, what can you bring, in your 2 suitcases as a doctor, including not being allowed to bring medical supplies. And the kids really had missed out on having lollies and chocolates, like proper lollies and chocolates. And so I think I'd brought like 6 kilos of lollipops. And so you can imagine if you take lollipops out in a hospital where there are thousands of displaced children, you're going to get swamped. So they took us to the paediatric or the children's ward, and they closed the doors so that we would just go around and see the children that were in the hospital. And everyone was malnourished, bones sticking out of all of their limbs. Again, we're talking about feeling guilty, not being able to provide medical care. I mean, I felt pretty ashamed trying to give out lollipops to kids that were starving. But that was all we had at that point. I think for me, hearing Chris speak again, I was fortunate enough to be on a webinar with him a few weeks ago, and that got me thinking a lot about how all of the ways systematically that Israel has targeted with intentionality all forms of societal infrastructure to be able to allow these genocidal acts to continue. So even, so I mentioned the nappy and baby formula. At the bottom of the stairs of our accommodation at Al-Aqsa, there was a warehouse for all of the baby formula and other things and supplies. And so all the families would line up every morning to be able to get their 1 bottle of baby formula for the month for their family. And you would see it. You would go up and down the stairs going to and from the 2 buildings of that hospital. So put aside even the fact that I don't have sterile gloves, I don't have antibiotics, I don't have adequate pain relief, I don't have water or power or electricity to have the operating room work in order for me to be able to do my job. And yet we've got all of that happening in the background. When I went back in December, the situation was worse, and the only thing I can say now is that it is beyond desperation. If I played for you the voice notes that people send me now, there's very little hope in what they say to me. And that's very, very difficult. 2 months of blockade and counting is, I look around and we're eating food here today and they don't have anything. That's very, very hard to reconcile. But even from, if we try and focus on some of the gender-based violence, imagine being a mother who gave birth to premature twins. So this was the older sister of one of the kids' families that I got to know in the hospital. They were 7 months old, they weighed 1.9 kilos, and she got sent home at day 3 to go back to the tent that they lived in with 9 people, and it's 2 by 3 meters. There was me and 6 kids and her mother, and they made me a cup of hot chocolate to have while we all sat around and I got to meet her babies. And it's a miracle, honestly, that they're alive and that she can try to raise them. Yeah. But even things like, I would have the nurses constantly ask me for sanitary pads, shampoo and conditioner. People have had their hair fall out because they're unable to be able to wash properly. We might not think of these things as important, but I think any female in the audience would know that these are critical things to being able to just try to function in everyday society. And the final couple of stories I wanted to mention, we were talking about it takes a village to organise something like this. Well, it also takes a village to raise a child, but society there, especially during what's happened over the last 19 months, is very, very difficult for women. So, there's a lot of dependency on the men either finding space for the tents or being able to try to connect water or the solar panels to be able to get some form of electricity. And although there is disproportionate targeting of women and children, if you also take out the men, you take out the ability for the women and kids to be able to survive. So one of the displaced families living in our accommodation was Imziad and her 2 boys, and her eldest brother and youngest brother were in a car travelling towards the hospital, and that car got bombed. And I happened to come back one day during the day back to the accommodation, and they were sitting around having a bet ajr, which is what you do Islamically, when you've got people who've passed away. And again, so I went to go pay my respects to her, but this was a constant theme where you've got sons, uncles, brothers, even young men being taken out, and that also affects the family's ability to be able to survive.
I don't even have words, to be honest. What do I even say to that? I just think about that last point is such an important point, the taking out of the lifelines, because you hear about the direct, the direct massacres, the direct numbers, the people who have been directly killed, but of course we know that there's hundreds of thousands in that count who have been indirectly killed in all these different ways, and that's definitely one of them. Safaa, I'd like to turn to you in thinking a bit more about, we've obviously heard from the ground directly, two different sources, and I'm wondering, how do reports like this one help you, given that you're a local organizer, you have a local community here, many of whom are in the room? How do reports like this help you with the work that you do domestically to raise awareness and to mobilize people into action?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Noor.
Oh.
Noor Haidar. Trying to give credit where credit is due because plagiarism is bad.
How does it help us mobilize as a local grassroots community? So we had the election last week, and our local, shout out to the Greens out the back there, our local Greens out here in both Whitlam and Cunningham, very outspoken about the Palestinian issue, but also, there was a lot of us within our community of the grassroots Palestinian Solidarity movement were out campaigning with those in our local electorates who are standing with us. And reports like that have also shown, I guess, the Illawarra is an area that is a grassroots area, right? It is built on industry. It's built on a community that sees itself as working class, that sees itself as grassroots. And when a report like Chris's comes out and talks about injustices, I feel that people in the Illawarra take that kind of personal, because the Illawarra prides itself on being a grassroots type movement. And also, you know, we've got amazing people within our community where tomorrow we'll be holding a picket outside of Bissaloy. So please attend. We'll be there at 5:45 tomorrow morning saying no steel in the Illawarra to armour genocide. So that is also part of our grassroots movements here in the Illawarra. And reports like Chris's, you know, helps with the Illawarra Women's Health Centre mobilised to host a talk like tonight's.
Such a critical evidence base, I think, for us to be able to use it as a, you know, at its most basic, a policy document to influence decision makers, to influence policy makers, to be able to take it to other, not just politicians and political leaders. I mean, talking about the election is way too soon, and it's a sore point, but using it to also create awareness and connection with other groups, like even lawyers who are traditionally, you know, conservative in, you know, broadly speaking. So having this is certainly something I would think as a document is an access point to be able to shift the narrative, give a little bit more information, and hopefully change perspectives. I mean, in theory, right? That's what we want. I'm interested, Bushra, I'm not sure if you've been meeting with different leaders, groups. I know you've done a lot of speaking, so is something like this helpful to you? Can you imagine it being, you know, something that you use to further your advocacy efforts?
So after I came back in July, so I'm part of a group also called ANZ Doctors for Palestine, and they had been doing some meetings with politicians, and so I started to become involved a little bit more on that. You know, the one thing that I'll say is a lot of people who've been doing this type of advocacy work for a lot longer than I have, such as Sara and Nasser Mashni and Randa, you know, they always told me after I came back that you can't argue with first-hand experience. And so I think it was exceptionally important that anyone who'd been over there really try to bring back the stories and amplify the voices of what we'd heard and seen on the ground, and be able to share that with people. It's like, I think meeting with them is mostly like banging your head against a wall. I mean, you feel like you're describing ethnic cleansing and genocide, and it just passes straight through them for the most part. I mean, for the people who are sympathetic, it's fine because they already are on brand with the cause and they understand and they're fighting for the Palestinians. But I think I didn't necessarily refer to reports such as that because I think the key is that you have to make people connect, and the best way for people to connect is to remember a story of someone. So, you know, for me, Chris mentioned in his report about even accessing prenatal care. So in the accommodation that we had, Imaiz was the lady who was sort of like a cook / support person / cleaner. And I started noticing she was becoming really, really tired. And so I said to her, oh, you know, you feeling okay? And she said, oh, well, actually, like I'm pregnant with twins. And she's a high-risk pregnancy because she was 40 years old and pre-diabetic. Now, there's no folate in any of the food that she's getting. There's no screening. There's no adequate nutrition. She goes back, so she works all day, not really getting paid for what she does, and then she goes back to a tent at night that in winter is freezing. You know, like the security guard that would be with us during the day said when he went one night to sleep back in the tent with his family, like he almost froze to death, he felt. So just by coincidence, one of the nurses that I worked with in theatre happens to volunteer for an international organisation that does prenatal care. And so I was able to connect them together. And so at least for now, she's able to access some form of prenatal care. But I think of all of the thousands of other women who don't get that. And the only other thing I feel like people really understand here in Australia is breast cancer. I mean, we've got screening mammograms here for women. you don't have any of that over there. I had a 40-year-old lady chase me down the street with her husband and show me a CT scan report that she wanted me to interpret for her. And it was that she was riddled with cancer all throughout her body because she wasn't able to access any of the imaging in the last couple of months since she'd had her symptoms. So, I mean, at every single level that you can think of, medical, safety, nutrition, housing, security, like it's just all being bombarded. And so I think for me, I asked Chris a question recently in the webinar, which I'd love for him to maybe answer for this audience here, which was, what's the real importance of this work? I don't know if you remember that, Chris, if you wanted to share it with them, because I think it's very relevant, actually.
I remember it because it's the question I ask myself every day. And I have to answer in point form.
I appreciate the point.
Point one, simply recording the authoritative account of what has happened is the very least that victims are entitled to. And that was a lesson that I learnt when doing the Stolen Generation report. When I sat for days and days and days listening to Indigenous people, either the children or the mothers, talking about what happened, and they said, and no one has ever listened to us and acknowledged what happened and recorded it. And I came to the conclusion then that the most important contribution the Human Rights Commission made was once and for all to record the history of what had happened to Indigenous mothers and children. And having learnt that 30 years ago, I feel the very least that we can do is to set the historical record. Then a little bit more effective, if you like, result-oriented than that, is that we work very closely with courts. We work closely with the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and increasing numbers of national courts where there are cases being taken about the situation in Gaza. And our investigations are forming the basis of those cases. So when the International Criminal Court issued warrants relating to Netanyahu and Gallant last year, they relied on our reports. And when the International Court of Justice last July issued its advisory opinion that found the occupation unlawful, it relied on our reports. So we are finding already, and we will find increasingly, that the work that we are doing is contributing towards accountability by being a basis of court reports. But they're informing governments, they're having an impact in the General Assembly, but the bottom line is that we are failing. I feel keenly every day that I cannot say that one child is alive because of our work. Not one. You can. Maybe I should have been a doctor rather than a lawyer, huh? But not one. And we keep on doing this, but not one kid is alive because of what we've done.
Yet. Not one kid yet. So, not to finish on that very sad point, but what I took away from what Chris told us a few weeks ago is that, unfortunately, maybe nothing that we do now will give us quick results, but at some point, hopefully in the future, we'll be able to look back and say that each of us did what they could at that time. And so, although I don't use necessarily those reports when I speak to people, I do feel that people in healthcare probably look upon reports such as that with renewed interest, because they definitely love evidence base. And so you just have to be able to try to connect it with the stories to make it more impactful.
As you mentioned that quote, the people can't fight your emotion or your firsthand experience, or they can't argue with it. As you mentioned it, I was thinking it, so I think we vibed on that point. But more so, I was also thinking about the amount of effort that is going into discrediting reports like this as well. And so, Chris, I want to throw this to you and maybe open up to Bushra and Safaa as well. It's a comprehensive report. It's 50 pages long. You've got 19 recommendations. And when it was covered in mainstream media, there were elements of the media that labeled these findings as accusations as opposed to conclusions, recommendations, and so on. So this is a clear tactic to undermine the credibility of this report and the conclusions that you've drawn. I wonder what you make of that, what you make of the fact that they're being reframed or positioned as accusations. What's the underlying point there?
Look, here I become very cynical. There are a lot of people whose only objective is justifying the actions of the State of Israel no matter what. And that certainly applies to the Israeli government, and it applies to many politicians, and it applies to some parts of the media. So, first of all, I just take it for granted, and to be perfectly honest, I hate to admit this, it has virtually no impact on me whatsoever. I just take it, when Netanyahu says that I'm an anti-Semite, as he does all the time, I have to say, find encouragement in that, because he cannot have any other argument to use against the work that we are doing. This is the last refuge of scoundrels. So they don't bother answering the report, they don't bother questioning the evidence, because they can't question the evidence and they can't question the legal analysis. All they can do is resort to personal invective or language that attempts to minimise the significance of what we're doing. But that's the way of some parts of the world, I'm afraid.
Safaa, what do you make of these attempts that we see every day? It's not just obviously towards the report, but the attempts to obfuscate, the attempts to smokescreen and conflate in mainstream media that undermine really our cause. What do you make of that? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Look, it's not new, Sara, right? We've been seeing this happen to us. I'm 43 now, so I've been watching mainstream media since I moved to Australia when I was 6. It's always been reported as Palestinian terrorist attack. Israel has the right to self-defense. We've become so dehumanized that when a Palestinian man dies, it's not something that anybody would feel sadness over, because it was justified, and that's how we've always been portrayed in the media, right? So when, a report like Chris's is attacked, it's nothing new, is it? It's what we've experienced our entire lives. Actually, I have to say, I am seeing glimmers of hope when The Guardian posts something online now, and it actually says Palestinians killed, not Palestinians died. They somehow just died for no other reason.
We still don't know who killed them, but
right?
At least we know that they were killed. So there's some sort of verb there, which is good, just no agent.
They died, not killed. But if an Israeli is killed, it's not Israeli killed. It's mother of 3 murdered by Hamas. You know what I mean? So it's nothing new for us. This is what we've always lived through. And now I say that there's glimmers of hope. It's being reported differently.
Or crumbs, perhaps, that we're taking here and there. Dr. Bushra Othman, do you have any thoughts on media shifts and narratives?
Other than to say that doctors don't necessarily do a lot of media. But again, it's, today Wednesday? Yesterday. I spoke at the surgical conference in the global health section. And one of the points that I made actually was that surgeons, but also doctors, are storytellers and educators and advocates as well. And so I think even in the way that we use language when we transmit information from where we've been is important, and we're trying to counter what people have been accepting for many, many years as normal. So, you know, I say often I am Palestinian, so if I can speak Arabic, I say Gaza the way that it should be said, Gaza. And so there's no reason that you don't have to say it, Chris. We spoke about this last time.
I'll also let you get away with not saying Palestine.
Yeah. But these are small little things that just go back to feeling like we're just reclaiming our culture, reclaiming our language, and ensuring that that gets passed on. And so I think it's, you don't have to be a doctor to save a life, but you can use it no matter what.
I know we're meant to do an open floor Q&A, but I was wondering if I had time to ask 2 more sneaky questions before. Is that all right, before opening the floor? I know everyone is eager, but so am I. So I'm drunk on my own power, I guess, and I'm going to ask you a question, Chris, about the ICJ. So you mentioned the ICJ, and we know that it handed down its advisory opinion last year that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal, and that UN experts called on states to, quote unquote, immediately review all diplomatic, political, and economic ties with Israel, inclusive of business and finance, pension funds, academia, and charities. In Australia, we are quite a long way from that. What responsibility does the Australian government have to act, especially now that we have a second-term Labor government? What are your views on that?
The responsibility in law is easy to state. It says that the Australian government and all governments must not do anything that aids or abets the continuation of the unlawful occupation or the settlements, but must act to bring the unlawfulness to an end. That's what the International Court of Justice said. And then it gave a number of broad areas in which that action should be taken. And it was there that it mentioned diplomatic, business, commercial, and said that it's up to states to do their own internal reviews and to work out whether there is anything that it is doing that aids and abets the continuation of the occupation and to address it. Now, I'm not aware of the Australian government having done that, even though the International Court of Justice told it to do it. And the United Nations General Assembly in September passed a resolution to implement the court's decision, and it told Australia to do it. So it needs to be looking at this question. In what ways is Australia aiding and abetting the occupation? One thing that I find absolutely obvious is that anything whatsoever that aids the settlements militarily or economically or politically must be stopped. I don't see the court's decision as immediately resulting in total sanctions on Israel, although it may, but I don't necessarily see that. But I do see it as requiring action that stops all support for the continuation of settlements. And to give you one very specific example, if we are involved in trading in settlement products, that would constitute aiding and abetting. So although it's arguable that trading in products made in Israel is not yet unlawful, I don't think it is arguable that trading in settlement products is unlawful. But another area would be providing tax deductibilities to organisations in Australia that collect money to send to maintain settlements or for the establishment of settlements. that is clearly unlawful under the ICJ's decision. So we really are required to do a comprehensive review across all areas of possible political, economic and other relationships to determine what actions are aiding and abetting the continuation of unlawfulness.
Thank you, and I can definitely confirm that there is work being done behind the scenes on that one in particular. Very briefly, Bushra and Safaa, before we open to the floor, what role do you think we have to bring about the changes that Chris is mentioning? What role can we play?
Oh, there's so many things. You can go macroscopic, you can go microscopic. I'll say two things really. I mean, one, I've given up on institutions as a whole and now just believe in people power, which is I think what anyone in grassroots would tell you anyway.
You're in the right place for it, it seems like.
But also just to say that I think everyone keeps forgetting about the ripple effect that they will have on the community around them. So the direct contact that they have with anyone through work or their community or sporting clubs or hobbies, whatever it is that you do. And the second would just be BDS, to really pick a few things, even key things that you could do BDS and share the knowledge about that.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.net if you don't know what BDS is. Safaa.
Yeah, what I've been thinking about a lot lately is we all have family and we all have friends and we all have those people in our lives who still believe that line that Israel has the right to self-defense, right? But we've seen the evidence that this is not self-defense. We've seen the videos. We've seen, I mean, there's nothing left to see, that, you know. But I like to go in with love. So instead of yelling and screaming at your family members who believe in Israel's right to self-defense, question it with genuine curiosity, like you would if they had, you know, differing opinions on any other topic. That's how I would approach it. But I wouldn't just approach it with one person. I'd try and approach it with 2 or 3. But you also have those family members who are still teetering on the edge and who still feel like, oh, there's no point in doing anything. Bring them along to a protest. Bring them along to a picket. Talk to them about boycotting, even if it's just Coke or McDonald's. Something small and practical, yes. And every small step forward is still a step forward, right?
Usually my approach is, I ain't reading all that, free Palestine, but that's just me. I don't have the patience anymore, but I think that's really, I think that's the hard work, right? That's the hard work of organizers and activists, being able to meet people where they're at, and it is really hard to hear people try and debate genocide or both sides it and so on, but I think, at the end of the day, that these are the spaces where we can grow the movement as well. I would like to open the floor to questions. Chris, I might just repeat the question in a nutshell. So you earlier explained genocidal acts in your keynote, and then you also mentioned genocidal intent, and you said that there were steps being taken towards that. So sort of elaborating on that to answer Alisar's question.
I accept that there are all of the examples that you state, and most of the examples that you state fall into the legal... I'm sorry, I'm going to have to answer like a lawyer. Yeah. fall into the legal category of incitement to genocide. But incitement to genocide is a different crime from the crime of genocide. And statements made by, for example, Australian leaders or American leaders are irrelevant to the crime of genocide unless it can be established that they're in a position of some form of command responsibility, that what they say they are going to do will be carried out because they're the ones saying it. So attaching a statement by Netanyahu or by the chief of the military is straightforward. It's more difficult if you're talking about a member of the Knesset, because a member of the Knesset may have no role whatsoever in establishing government policy and issuing instructions to the army. And so you have to establish a line of causation, if you like, that this person's statement, because of the position the person occupied, can lead to policy and lead to action on the ground. And then to make it harder again is some of the jurisprudence of the courts, where it is possible to use circumstantial evidence, but to establish genocidal intent through circumstantial evidence, that must be the only reasonable inference that can be drawn. Now, I personally think that test is wrong. I think it's too high. But that's the test that's been set and accepted by a variety of international courts, so I'm stuck with it. And that is the hardest part of it, to establish that there is no other reasonable inference except the genocidal purpose.
Very, very, very cynical answer from me. As a Palestinian, I don't think that our liberation ultimately is going to be found in political or legal institutions. That's not to say that there is not a role for them or that they don't have a place. Obviously, I'm in this area for a reason. So I do think that we need to tactically engage as much as possible and use every tool in the toolbox at our disposal. There may not be any guarantees of the outcomes, but I don't think we can afford not to try. So in my mind, we have to try everything. And if that means this pathway, limited as it might be to some, and other more grassroots or more radical or more different pathways, that's also, that's, I guess, where I come from. Safaa, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to ask Chris a question. Do you think the test is so high because the punishment, if the intent is found, is so high as well?
Look, I think, I don't mean this as a cynical answer though. No, I don't. I think that courts are so worried about the implications of finding genocide, not because of the punishment, but because of the nature of the crime, that they have shied away, that they have withdrawn from being in a situation of finding it.
Now I'm going down my own rabbit hole. But if it were to be lowered, for example, right, would that mean then that other nations would also be found criminally culpable and maybe...
Yes.
Well, there's always politics. I mean, we can at least be honest, I guess, about that, or acknowledge that it's not. It's hard to say that it's not political. It's very political, I guess. Yeah, Chris, do you want to add anything? Are you happy me to throw?
I think that's...
We have I'll go with yes, right over here at the front.
Just in line with the recent election, the government had passed hate speech laws towards anti-Semitism. When is the narrative going to be turned around that it is uniformly across every border, and that we have a voice, that we are allowed to speak, and that we are not stigmatised with the oppression and the, the baggage that comes when they see us like this? And I know I'm talking about it because it is also the stigma that comes across, not just here. The action has now expanded all across the Middle East to all the neighbouring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. When are we going to start saying enough is enough and make the government held accountable for the double standards and the hypocrisy?
That's more, I think, of a comment that we can all agree on than a question, for sure. But all I would say is, we have to contend with the fact that this is an entity, so elements of the Israeli lobby, for example, in Australia, whose MO is pretty much universal everywhere you go, in that it is an entity that is invested in our erasure and in our persecution wherever we are. And this is an entity, or representatives of it, who have spent and poured billions of dollars into painting us and constructing us as suspect, as other, as as dehumanized as possible. And we see that through their political junkets to Israel, to quote unquote Israel, through their media tours to Israel. We know that that's how they shift and, as I said, construct us as that. And they are connected to parliament, they are connected, or to the halls of power, they are connected to mainstream media. And the thing that I take solace in is that in the last 18 months, I mean, anyone who just tuned in obviously wasn't paying attention prior, but we are contending with decades of this. We are contending with decades and architecture of post 9/11 Islamophobia, right? War on terror. So this is a lot. But what I do take solace in is the fact that the scale of solidarity that we have seen and the shift, like, we broke their billion-dollar PR campaigns for free. Like,
Exactly.
that's the amazing thing, right? So there has been change. Of course there's been change. And the one thing I really, really do want to acknowledge as well, more than anything else, is that I don't take for granted the fact that we are here and we're able to use terms like settler colonialism in mainstream, or in some spaces. We weren't able to use even that term 5 years ago, okay? And that's because of the staunch First Nations activists who are leading, paving the way in struggle for justice and supporting Palestinians in Black Palestinian Solidarity across in every space I turn. So I really want to acknowledge that. We are up against, it's a long battle. We're up against, a huge asymmetry of power, but there are cracks and we are chipping away.
And I also want to add, if you've been having a look for the last 18 months, people are not falling for it anymore. When we get labelled as anti-Semites or we get labelled as terrorists, I see and I hear a whole group of people going, no, what's the context? People are now asking about the context. People are now saying, why is this happening in Palestine? Or why are Palestinians resisting? Or what does Palestinian resistance look like? And, I want to acknowledge Palestinian women's resistance. Palestinian women's resistance has been around for as long as the occupation, yeah? And Palestinian women have not just resisted every day through raising families and teaching their children. We've been engaged in workplaces and we've resisted in armed resistance, and we've held every type of form of resistance that our men have resisted in. So.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that from arts to academia to healthcare and everything in between, we are definitely raising critical consciousness. So I'm very hopeful about that, at least. We're going to take 2 more questions. So there's one at the back over there.
How has Australia brought Israel's sexual and gendered violence against women here? And how has this violence uniquely affected Palestinian Australian women?
We're seen as the perfect victim. Arab Muslim women in Australia. We either need to be saved from our men, or we need to be saved from oppression. We're not seen as autonomous beings in this country. And look, we have our gendered issues within our community, right? However, I see 2 Palestinian Muslim women sitting on either side of me who don't need to be liberated because they've done that themselves. But when we are portrayed by Murdoch media, we are portrayed as the perfect victim. We're not portrayed as autonomous beings who work and live and pay taxes and engage in everyday society. Right? Bushra, you add to it. I'm sure you've got more.
The one thing that I'll say, I suppose, or two things. One is that if you look like Sara or me, you're very visibly Muslim and obviously female and of the Islamic faith. So you can be a target, whether that be physically or otherwise. So how has it brought it here? I don't think it's brought it here. I think it was already here to begin with. I mean, we're not necessarily always considered as the same. And so it's been present ever since we came to Australia in 1992. I mean, my mum wears the headscarf and she's a lecturer in engineering at RMIT, and so she's been dealing with racism and sexism for the last 20 odd years or so, or even more than that. So I would say that I think it always existed. Some of it has definitely been much more visible in the last 19 months for Muslim women here in Australia. And I'm lucky to say that I haven't necessarily been on the receiving end of some of that, but I certainly know some of my friends and colleagues who have. And how do you counter that? Well, I mean, that requires it a fight across all different levels. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if it'll get worse before it'll get better. And the one other thing that you mentioned, and Chris touched upon this before, is, Sara asked me before if I'd had any meetings with leaders. I've had so many politicians tell me that we're not involved in arms trade, we're not involved in so many things.
Gaslighting.
So, yeah, and as a doctor, I don't necessarily have all of that information on hand, and so, there's a lot of work that has to go into trying to disprove and discredit all of that gaslighting that happens, and I understand that there's a lot of that happening in the background. And the last thing that I'll add to this lady's comment from before is that up until now, the law doesn't state that you can be punished for criticising the state of Israel for what it does. I mean, you can't be making hate comments against a group of people, whether that be religious or ethnic or cultural or otherwise, but we are more than free to definitely comment on what the state of Israel does in Gaza and the West Bank. And so I think I just remind myself that you always have to bring it back to that, because they're the true perpetrators of this genocide.
Thanks, Bushra. Yep, the last question.
Is there any hope? And the second thing is, what else can we at the grassroots do differently to shift the dial? Because after so many months of seeing so many people being killed, starved, maimed, what more can we do to say this is really unacceptable? It is not humane.
Contrary to all the evidence, I do see hope. And it's the things that you three have been saying all night. That's where the hope lies. I see shifts in community opinion. In this country, certainly, but in other countries as well. To take the most extreme example, if you like, there are fundamental debates now taking place within Israel that have not taken place before amongst Jewish Israeli people. And that we're starting to see things develop. I even did an interview on Israeli media a few weeks ago. Now, the interviewer was very hostile, but I considered it a sign of hope that I was actually able to speak directly to Israeli people for the first time, because everything that we do is reported through the perspective of the Israeli government before that. Now, that's trifling, meaningless in one sense, but it gave me encouragement. I do see more critical questioning going on. I do see a widening sense of revulsion at what has happened and is continuing to happen in Gaza. I see small shifts in political opinion here. And by small, I mean that the government has, over the last 18 months, been voting differently in the UN from what it voted previously. Now, that's only small. but it is a shift. And what we need now is for them to take the rhetoric of UN votes and apply it, as I said, to a proper examination of ways in which Australia is aiding and abetting unlawful activity. You know, we've got to move beyond what's happened to date. But the fact that shift is starting to occur, I think, is positive. And I think that, you know, even on the question of the BDS movement, I encounter individuals who are acting on BDS in an individual capacity. They're not waiting for decisions to be made by governments, and they're exercising their power as consumers. And I think that is widening. You know, I'm a very old man. I was involved 50-something years ago in the anti-apartheid movement, and it was consumer boycotts that started the whole process here, that eventually the then Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser became one of the strongest international advocates. So I think there are historical examples where people have effected significant shifts, and I agree completely that, you know, you can use me as a lawyer and you can use institutions, but that's not really where the action is. They are allies or other means for pursuing the same kind of causes, and I agree completely that the multi-pronged approach is the only way to achieve success. So I do see hope, and I think if I didn't, I wouldn't still be doing what I'm doing with the Commission of Inquiry.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have you all in the room. I know that you're keen to say more on this, but perhaps afterwards we can stick around and chat to people and maybe leave with a little less despair and a bit more hope, because you know what? So many of us have paid the price, really dear price. We've lost family, we've lost relationships, we've lost jobs, we've been persecuted in ways that have been, you know, that shouldn't be surprising or shocking, but it has been really difficult. But I think for me, at the end of the day, I don't let that scare me. I let it inform me, you know, because Hind is worth every risk, and Rifat is worth every risk, and Hussam is worth every risk. Gaza is worth every risk. So, you know, the last thing I'll say is we are seeing public conversations about Palestine being stifled and shut down. We are seeing members be targeted, persecuted, harassed, our most prominent advocates, and the reason for that is to isolate us, to scare us, to stop us from doing what we are doing, to stop us from gathering in places like this and having these critical conversations and moving into action. So really, it's been such a privilege for me to be on this panel alongside you, to have you in this room, and to hear from you as such a well-informed panel, bringing different perspectives and insights into these issues. So please, everyone, thank me in joining our panel for the evening.
I think we all know that what we have to do is we have to stand up for Palestine. I think we know that there's another way of saying that, and that means that we have to stand up for human rights and that we have to stand up for humanity, because that's exactly what we're doing and that's what needs to be done. I think we all know people, we have friends or family or community in Gaza. I know I have friends there now, and I know what I saw there amid all the destruction and the horror was the light of humanity. And I think it's our responsibility to maintain that light with the hope that our panel has given us tonight. So please, a round of applause for them, but also for Auntie Barb, a friend of Palestine.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We will live in peace. We will live in peace. We will live in peace. We will live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall live in peace one day. Now, Lily and I wrote this song. We will fight for others. We will fight for others. We will fight for others. We will fight for others today. Today. United we stand. Oh, united we stand. Together we are strong. Together we are strong. And we will fight for others today.